The NFL playoffs keep rolling along, with the league down to their final 4 teams. Meanwhile, Seattle's search for Pete Carroll's successor continues, as big offseason decisions await. ESPN Seahawks beat reporter Brady Henderson joins us to make sense of it all. Let's light him up.
I'm Jacson Bevins, and this is Cigar Thoughts.
Welcome back to the Cigar Lounge. I am Jacson Bevins, and along with my post-pubescent producer, Mike Barwin, this is the Cigar Thoughts podcast. Mike, how are we doing today?
Oh, my God. Well, I don't know after that, but yeah, I mean, it's conference championship time, buddy. We are at the Final Four of the NFL. The Seahawks are unfortunately not among that Final Four, but narratives abound. I think that we're both pretty excited for the football that lays ahead of us this weekend. And yeah, man, this is what it's all about. Down to the cream of the crop. How are you?
This is the good shit right here, man. This is the good shit. I love the Final Four. Like from last weekend on, I think just peak football. You're seeing the best teams. It comes down to a pure styles makes fights situation. Yeah. Super excited for it. And you know, the Seahawks themselves, they got some hefty choices to make this offseason. And that starts with the head coach, of course. Now, it's been a couple weeks since they announced that they're moving on from Pete Carroll. Mike, who are you pulling for?
I've given this a good amount of thought, and I know we'll get into this with Brady throughout the course of this episode and how the league has moved towards hiring the young upstart offensive minds, a lot of which stem from the Shanahan tree and the McVay branch and so on and so forth. You've got 2 coaches / play callers in your division that you have not been able to beat for years. And yes, the first step to being a good team is winning the games in your division. Mm-hmm. I am leaning towards Mike Macdonald for the simple fact that, you know, I miss good defense, man. The Seahawks haven't had a great defense in a long time. And they've got personnel to put together what I think should be a good defense. And so, you know, that could be an indictment of Carroll, of Clint Hurt, of all of the above. But I think that it would be cool to see the Seahawks hire somebody that can deploy the weapons that they have, including Jamal Adams potentially. I think that somebody that can weaponize him to the peak of what we were hoping he could be and what he once was is paramount for the team.
Because they've tried that for the last 3 years, and it hasn't really worked. And it's so funny because, and I'm sure, you know, I'm not sure if I'll get the opportunity to necessarily say this during the show when we have Brady on, but like my number one guy is Mike Macdonald, because I care the most about beating Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay. And also, like, don't overlook the trajectory that the Cardinals are on. Yep. So it's like, you look at Mike Macdonald's track record, like he's beat all those guys. And, you know, he's held them to, from an EPA perspective, well under what they normally do in terms of offense. So yeah, McDonald's my number one. I'm right there with you. And I'm excited to hear what Brady has to say about it. But first, if you're listening or watching us right now, hopefully it's because you like the show. And if you like the show, there are a few ways you can support it. If you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, take a couple of seconds, leave us a 5-star rating. And if you're feeling super supportive, a quick review as well. You can do that right now. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll find full video episodes, entertaining clips, and the audio reads of every Cigar Thoughts article. This is probably the best way to help the show grow, and growth is going to enable us to bring more of our football discourse your way, so we're grateful for the few seconds it takes to like and subscribe. All right, man. I'm really excited about today's guest, because he's not only great to talk to, but is really dialed into the Seahawks and how they operate. He covers the Hawks for ESPN, and the last time we had him on, he had just published his monumental article detailing the events leading up to the Russell Wilson trade. He is Brady Henderson. Brady, thanks for coming back in.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It's been a minute.
It has, man, since the article that rocked the Pacific Northwest. Now that we're like a year and a half clear of that, man, what was that like for you?
Yeah, well, like I was telling you before we came on here, I think that story took a couple of years off of my life just because, anytime there's that type of story, at ESPN, the editing process is pretty demanding, as it should be, just because that's an important topic, and there's a lot of sources that went involved in that story, some of them on background, and so there's certain guidelines that you got to adhere to when you're using anonymous sources like that, and then just knowing how big of a topic that was going to be. I mean, I take my work very seriously, as I think a lot of journalists do, and just knowing the magnitude of that story, it honestly it weighed on me just because it was very important to me to have everything completely buttoned up in that story and completely accurate.
Because there's going to be a lot of people coming after it, right? And trying to discredit it and trying to say that it's not true. How nervous were you when you submitted that? Or were you just like, hey, I got this thing airtight?
Yeah, I'll tell you a fun story about that. So I knew it was going to happen. I knew it was going to come from all angles, from people involved in the story, from Denver fans, from just casual NFL fans. And I ultimately got to a place where I said I accepted it. And I said, that's fine. That's just the nature of it. And I'll tell you one thing I did. I think that a night or two before the story published, I rewatched one of my favorite movies, which is called Kill the Messenger. And it's about the San Jose Mercury News reporter named Gary Webb, who, a couple of decades ago, he uncovered this just massive, massive story about some really shady stuff involving the CIA and, some Central American country that was involved in the drug trade and everything. And so the reason I rewatched it is because it was a lesson to me. It was a reminder to me that at the end of the day, this is just football. This is not, CIA, top level stuff like that. And it's at the end of the day, it's going to be fine. You got to deal with the blowback and the predictable blowback. And, again, I knew that I could stand by everything that I reported and wrote in the story, and I could defend it. And so that was good enough for me.
Well, it was one of my favorite pieces of investigative journalism that I've ever read. And
Thank you.
It was really cool to just have you on kind of right after that. But now that the dust has settled from that, there's different stuff going on in Seattle that's just as big of a deal. And obviously, the coaching search is top of mind for most Seahawks fans right now. But before we dive into that, I do want to get your thoughts on the 2023 season and how it might inform the process of hiring the next coaching staff. Start by telling me what your expectations were for this team coming into the season, and then in what areas did they exceed or fall short of those expectations?
Yeah, I looked at them as a 10, maybe 11 win team. So they underachieved. I didn't think that they had done enough, nor I didn't think that any team could do enough in one offseason to close what was a pretty massive and obvious gap between them and the 49ers. Mm-hmm. And it was very evident, in 2022, and it was still evident in 2023. That said, I thought the moves that they made, that gap shouldn't have been as big as it still was. Right. And not just with the 49ers, but with the Rams and just in general. I thought they underachieved. And so it wasn't a total shock to me that they moved on from Pete Carroll. I thought that even if Carroll had remained, I thought it was possible that he could have fired both of his coordinators, just because you don't see teams look at times as hapless on both sides of the ball as they did. And maybe hapless is not the right word, at least for their offense. I mean, their offense was okay. Yeah, maybe it is.
It's not the right word.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that team underachieved on both sides of the ball. And so I don't think it was a total shock that, we're here where we're at right now.
Yeah, for me, and I think for a lot of people, the biggest thing is the defense. And it's like an ongoing mystery because Pete Carroll made his hay coming up as a defensive coach. He broke football with the Legion of Boom team, leading the NFL in points allowed for 4 straight seasons and really coaching something iconic. And then since then, they've just been kind of spinning their wheels on defense. And then 2022, I didn't think it was possible for the run defense to be worse than what we saw then. Yeah. And they made some moves to potentially shore that up. And for half the season, they were doing a pretty good job. Then from the Ravens game on, I mean, they looked so, I don't know if it was underprepared or outmanned or what. So if we focus on the defense to you, and let's just call it, they were bad. for the last 2 months of the season. Is that more of a personnel issue? Is that more of a coaching issue? How much does the Nwosu injury affect that? And how much should an injury to a guy like Uchenna Nwosu affect how good a defense can be?
Yeah, he's their best defensive player, in my opinion. And maybe, Devin Witherspoon is overtaking him. But any team that loses a guy of that caliber and who is that important to what they do up front, yeah, it's going to sting. But that certainly does not explain all of it. It is really hard to kind of put your finger on it. And certainly you had guys underperforming. Certainly they were undermanned in some spots. I think the Jamal Adams, the amount that he played was problematic, and especially when it was clear that he just was not himself. And eventually they went with Julian Love in that spot, and Julian Love had 2 interceptions, and helped them win the Philadelphia game. So I think if they had to do it all over again, I think they would have made that switch earlier. And look, it's not like you had to shut Adams down, but I don't understand why he was playing as much as he was, considering how physically limited he was. So and I think to an extent too, sticking with Woolen as long as they did. Now he got better as the season went on, and the coverage I think got better. But putting Mike, I think they should have kind of sent that message earlier and given Mike Jacson more playing time there, knowing that Jacson does really well the thing that Tariq Woolen does not do well, which is tackling. So there were some personnel moves. I question whether or not the scheme is the right one. I think last year you could have said, okay, the scheme, they're trying to install it largely in one offseason with a lot of new pieces. So maybe you could give them a pass for last season, but this past season and your second year there with, I think, second year of the coordinator, you just, that excuse runs out. And I just think that, in the big picture sense, this team had tried everything on defense, for the last 7-8 years.
That's the thing. It does feel like they tried different stuff. It wasn't, in my mind, stubbornness on the part of Pete Carroll or Clint Hurt. I think they were like, okay, this isn't working. Let's try something else. And that's fine. I really admire, because I think it's necessary, the ability and the willingness to pivot strategically if you need to. That said, nothing they tried worked. And in my mind, if I had to, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but in my mind, it's the inability of that defense to even be good, not even get back to great, but good. That for me would, if the decision was to move on from Pete Carroll, that would have ranked at the top. But I want to circle back to Jamal Adams. What the hell happened there in the last month of the season?
I think the injury just caught up to him. And it was, everybody in that building knew, and Adams knew himself, that this season was going to be a challenge. The injury that he suffered, the torn quad tendon, is not like your typical ACL injury.
No, it's one of the worst injuries you can get in football.
It's brutal. Yeah, some guys don't come back from it. It's not a very common injury, and it's a very difficult injury. And everybody realized that this season was going to be a struggle for him, and nobody expected him to be ready by the start of the season. And nobody expected him to be, like the injury was going to be behind him completely. And so I think that frustration and constantly having to deal with, I think that kind of spilled over into some of the stuff that happened with Adams off the field, on the sideline. That's not to say that I give him a pass for that, because some of that stuff was pretty ugly. But I just think that this was a very challenging season for him in a lot of ways, starting with just the fact that he physically was not right.
Are they done with him?
I think so, but I don't know for sure. Certainly you cannot have him back on with the contract as is, which is scheduled to count, I think, $27 million against the salary cap. For a guy who has not recorded a sack in over 3 calendar years, and a guy who hasn't played a full season in that span either, you just, there's no way in my mind. I give it a 0.0% chance that he is back on the same contract.
Yeah.
Now the challenge is, what do you do with the contract? It's not like, it's one thing, you can lower a guy's cap number if it's a young guy who's like performing, and maybe you give him a new deal. Maybe you restructure it to where you kind of push some of the cap charges into the future. It's not really that easy. It's not that simple with a guy in Adam's situation. And so I just don't know. I could very much see them just, washing their hands completely of it, moving on, saying they gave it their best shot and it didn't work. I could also see maybe a defensive-minded head coach comes in and convinces John Schneider that he can get Adams back to being, the 10-sack guy that he was in 2020. But again, that was 3 years ago. It's been a long time since he's really been a factor on defense.
Yeah, I think whoever comes in to coach this team that's gonna have a huge impact on whether Jamal Adams is around, and if so, in what role. Because to me, it's almost feeling like just move this guy into the box. Like, we've had issues, Seattle's had issues at linebacker, and while he may not be an excellent coverage safety, he's going to be an average to above average coverage linebacker. We know he can set the edge. We know the importance of that. He's built for playing in the box. Be curious to see if they bring, whoever the new defensive coordinator is, or if it's a defensive coach that they hire to run the show, what they do with that. Because that contract's an albatross at this point. Switching to the other side of the ball, unless you have Patrick Mahomes, quarterback becomes an issue. I mean, listen to the way they're talking about Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts right now, Justin Herbert, these are all quarterbacks Seahawks fans would kill to have, and even they are dealing with, are they good enough? Can they get them over the hump? Right. All that stuff. Looking at Geno, he's a bit of a lightning rod. Like I said, quarterback's going to be in a lot of fan bases. How do you feel he did? Because we've seen plenty of quarterbacks come in, a Case Keenum, a Nick Foles, have a really good season after kind of being a backup for a long time. And then you wonder, are they going to be able to keep this up? How do you feel Geno did in year 2 as a starter?
He was so-so. Look, I just think that the larger conversation about Geno is difficult for a lot of people to have, because we live in this era of social media reaction where you're either the GOAT or you're trash, and there's no in between. But there's a huge swath of that in between, and I think Geno falls in between that. I mean, at times he can play like a top 10 quarterback. At times he does not play like a top 10 quarterback. And look, I think he's clearly not one of those quarterbacks, and not to say that there are many of these guys. He's not a quarterback who can carry a team and make up for issues when everything's going wrong around you. And again, that's not a huge criticism of him, because there's not that many guys can do that. I mean, even Patrick Mahomes, he had a pretty crummy receiver core this season outside of Rashee Rice. Those guys were dropping passes left and right, and he was affected by that. And so, there's not a whole lot of guys that can thrive even when everything is going wrong around him. And I think he showed this season that, you didn't have a consistent run game. You dealt with, you had 2 productive, one especially, rookie receivers, but some of the issues that Geno had, I think, were products of the growing pains that those rookie receivers had. You had, 9 different starting combinations on their offensive line. The defense that, couldn't get off the field and didn't give the offense enough time. So I look at Geno's season, and there's no doubt that statistically he regressed. A lot of that was due to what was going on around him. So I think that is part of the context of what the Seahawks have with Geno. I think there's very much a long-term question about, is he the guy? And I think they could have to confront that question this offseason. It's not going to be easy, per se, to move on from him just because of some of the contract particulars and the timing of all that. But I don't think it's out of the question at all that they could move on from him. I could also see them, giving it another shot with him, seeing if a new coach / offensive system could try to get him back to his best form, because he's had 2 really good halves of seasons in the last 2 years. The first half of 22 and the second half, really the last, third of the season in 2023. Yep. So he's shown that he can do it. And I wonder if they'll be tempted to say, let's see what a new coach, a new system, if they can, put a full season together with him.
We've talked for a while about how the NFC this season was weaker than it normally is, and I think that's kind of a function of the NFL's quarterback landscape at this point. Obviously, there's more that goes into it, but if you lay out your ranking of all the NFL quarterbacks, the vast majority of your top 10 resides in the AFC. So looking at the quarterbacks in the NFC, how many of them are you taking over Geno Smith in 2024?
This is just for one season.
This is, I guess you just drop them into, you drop them all into the same situation. You say, I guess you have Seattle's weapons. Which quarterbacks are you trading Geno Smith for, like in a bottle?
Straight up, one for one.
So, yeah. Are you trading the contracts too, or is this just if you?
No, let's say the money. Let's say the money's
I guess
even.
just like which quarterback do you the money is equal, and who do you think has the best chance to win the most games next season?
Oh gosh, that's a really good one.
To me, there's two that are clearly ahead, and then I think you start having discussions.
Yeah,
and for me, that's Hurts and Stafford.
No Dak.
I think you're having the. I would take Dak over Geno. I would take it. It's less clear than the first two, but I would take Dak over Geno.
Yep.
Yeah, and with if this is just a 1-year proposition, then you're not worried about Matthew Stafford's age, and he's still one of the most talented quarterbacks in the NFL, even if he's getting up there in age and he's getting kind of banged up. Are there any others? I'm just going through each division.
Where do Jared Goff and Brock Purdy fall into this mix for you guys?
Okay, so here's this next tier for me. It's now you're talking Kirk Cousins, talking Jordan Love, Jared Goff, Brock Purdy, and I think those are all the guys that I would put like comfortably in Geno's tier. Baker Mayfield had a great season. I'm not sure that I'd make that trade straight up, but no. I don't know. Am I missing someone from that tier, Brady?
I mean, there's
Kyler. I would take Kyler over Geno.
Yeah, Derek Carr. I would not take Derek Carr over Geno. Certainly not whoever is playing quarterback for Atlanta. Certainly not Bryce Young.
No Sam Howell.
No Sam Howell. No, I think they should have drafted Sam Howell a couple years ago.
Would you trade for one season? Would you trade Geno Smith straight up for Justin Fields?
And the contract doesn't come into it.
All these quarterbacks get Geno's contract.
Fields is so young and so mobile would be intriguing, but if I've got to win that one season, no, I don't think I will.
Yeah, I don't think so either. All right, I've got 4 for sure. I'm taking over Geno, and then I'm probably still Kirk. But I think that they're like peers. Jordan Love is to me the most interesting one.
Yeah,
like because I wasn't a Jordan Love guy, and now I feel a little sheepish about that. But he looks awesome.
Yeah, well, how could anybody be a Jordan Love guy before this season? I mean, he had hardly
honestly
played.
Before November, it was hard to be a Jordan Love guy.
Right. Yeah, and I wish I hadn't seen him throw that last pass in the divisional round, which was just all sorts of ill-advised. But yeah, I mean, he looks like he could be one of the next real big-time quarterbacks, and not just in the NFC, but in the NFL. And I think the larger point that you're getting at here is a good one, that, as much as I think it's easy for fans and observers to hyper-focus on the quarterback issue on the team that they root for, or in my case, cover, and to just think that it'd be so easy to upgrade. But, this is a conversation that a lot of other, observers, fans, reporters are having about, the quarterbacks from other teams. And so it's a hard position to play. There's not a whole lot. There's not like, the upgrade is just right around the corner.
Brock Purdy or Geno Smith?
For one season?
For one season on the Seahawks.
On the Seahawks? It's...
That's the look of a man thinking about all the internet.
No, I don't. No, the internet can say whatever the hell it wants.
Whatever statement comes.
I really feel that Brock Purdy is like a Rorschach test, right? Like whatever it is that he's the ink blot on the paper, and then you project whatever you feel about NFL quarterbacks onto him. And I was texting with Danny and Mina about this yesterday, actually, and I said, Brock Purdy should be this wonderful opportunity for us to really explore the different ways to be successful in the NFL. And instead, we're stuck with a discourse that is just making all of us dumber.
Yeah. Is he a game manager? What,
Right.
Cam Newton kind of reignited that debate. I don't know. I mean, one of my best friends at ESPN is our 49ers guy, and he has made the point that, the narrative that Brock Purdy is just dumping the ball off to receivers and watching them, run 30 yards after the catch every time. That's just not the case. I mean,
he's not Jimmy Garoppolo, that's for sure.
He's not, yeah, and he's, I know he had the elbow injury, but he's healthier than Jimmy Garoppolo. I think he's more mobile than Jimmy Garoppolo. Maybe doesn't have the arm strength. And I mean, going back to the Geno versus Brock Purdy, I mean, Geno's a more talented quarterback than Purdy. There's no doubt about that. But Purdy, he gets it done, and it's not just, dumping the ball off. He's pushing the ball downfield with a lot of quarterbacks.
Yeah, and look, the numbers are undeniable. And at the end of the day, like, if you want to talk MVP, you can't just ignore the numbers because of, whatever you feel. Yeah, he's in an amazing situation. I just feel like Geno's putting up those numbers too if you drop him into that offense.
Yeah. Again, a more talented guy. Geno is not like he's not the dual threat quarterback, but he can run and he's got an arm. And we didn't see it as much this season just because Seattle's offense didn't push the ball downfield as much. I think that probably had a lot to do with the fact that the O-line situation was just in flux. And I wonder if, Shane Waldron trusted those guys to hold up in pass protection enough to have those kind of deep play action shots that were really a staple of that offense, Russell Wilson days, but also, the first half of what Geno did in 2022. And so there weren't as many of those plays, but Geno still got the arm, man. And that's it. It goes back to the conversation of potentially replacing him, like, for his faults and for as shaky as he was, like, the guy still has some talent, and I wonder what he could do with different coaches around him, different situation around him.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because you said earlier in the show you weren't shocked that the team decided to move on from Pete Carroll. My initial reaction was like, holy shit, like they did it, and once that settled, it was an emotional 48 hours for me. Those listening to the show and who read my stuff know what a personal impact Pete Carroll's approach and success had on me as a husband, as a professional. But, I also totally understand that, maybe the time had just come. So look, it's been a couple of weeks. The dust has settled a bit. Do you chalk the decision up to move on from Pete Carroll to the team just not winning enough games? Or do you think there was something more there?
I think there was a recognition from ownership that things had just gotten stagnant and that they had lost their edge. And I think Pete Carroll had an interesting comment about that in his farewell press conference about, why had the direction of the team gone the way it had. And he said that they had lost their edge to be great in the run game and in playing defense. And there just really wasn't anything that this team had been able to hang its hat on over the last few seasons. Now, I think that this decision was Jody Allen's, but I also don't think that – I think that John Schneider was ready to run his own show and to have personnel control. And I wonder if – I think Carroll alluded to on his radio show that, there had been that conversation in recent years about, was it nearing time for the roles to kind of switch there and for Carroll to give that final say up? I think there's been pretty big decisions over the last few years that would have gone differently had it been a more traditional power structure where the GM has final say. And so,
can you give an example of one of those?
I think Nick Chubb, Rashad Penny over Nick Chubb in 2018. I think that's one of them. I think that bringing Bobby Wagner back, and that's not to say that this move didn't work out, but bringing Bobby Wagner back, that was very much a Pete Carroll move and not a John Schneider move. And that's not to say that every move, that's not to say, that Carroll has made every single move on his own, nor is it to say that the moves that Schneider was the driving force behind, and Schneider and the scouting department, that's not to say that, they batted 1,000 on all of those moves. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard when you're talking about decisions at the top of this organization. It's really hard to get a 100% feel on it just because nobody's got an in to Jody Allen. And, she is the mystery of all mysteries in terms of NFL owners. And, the only time that we have heard from her was the, kind of boilerplate, statement that she put out about, this being the best thing for the organization. And so,
but make no mistake, she is involved as an owner. I mean, she's sitting in the draft room. She's not a hands off, oh, this was my brother's thing. She's in it.
Yeah. And Carroll even said, I think on his final radio show that, he went into his end of season meetings with Allen, a few weeks ago, knowing that he was going to get challenged because that's the way it has been in those end of season meetings. And so I don't know if Carroll was totally caught off guard by this or totally shocked by it, just knowing that, these meetings, this is not just, like something on her to-do list that day. And, it's some, hey, tell me about how the season, hey, how are you going to get better? Like, I think these were really tough meetings. And so, the larger point is that she just because we have not heard from her and just because she's been so invisible publicly, that does not mean that she has not been very heavily involved in things behind the scenes.
You've been covering John Schneider for a long time now. He is now essentially the longest tenured employee in Seattle. Based on what you know, what kind of coach do you think Schneider is looking for? And if he called you up and said, Brady, I want you to make the decision for me, which names are you gravitating towards?
I like the idea of an offensive-minded head coach, and I've talked a lot with Brian Nemhauser about this, and he's made a good point that the trend in the NFL is pretty clear, where offensive coaches, the majority of guys that are getting hired these days, not always, but it's offensive coaches, it's an offensive league, so the where you go from there is that, okay, let's say you're deciding between an offensive-minded and a defensive-minded head coach. So let's say you pick the defensive head coach. Then you've got to trust that guy to find the right offensive coordinator. Because I think, a head coach is only as good as the coordinators and the staff that he builds. So let's say he gets that right. He gets that hire right. Mm-hmm. So the moment that offense has success,
that's right,
that coordinator is going to get poached. And so then you're going to have to make you're going to have to make a new hire, and you're going to have to get that hire right again. If all else is equal, meaning if you feel equally strong about the offensive head coach and the defensive head coach, let's say in this case it's Dan Quinn versus Ben Johnson, then I think because of that, you might as well hire the offensive guy knowing that you're not going to have to replace him.
Protect the scheme.
Now,
right.
Yeah. Now, I think some people in the NFL will tell you that it's easier to build a defense than an offense. I also think that another way to look at this is it may not be, and that's what I just said there is maybe an oversimplification. I wonder if Schneider is looking at this coaching search as not just I'm going to hire the best head coach possible and let him pick the staff. I wonder if he's looking at it as what's the best combination of head coach and his counterpart coordinator. So if it's an offensive head coach, then a defensive coordinator. And they've cast a very wide net in this search, which is not surprising because that's what this team has done in free agency and draft, and they always leave no stone unturned. But I wonder if some of these guys that they're bringing in for interviews, I wonder if part of the motivation is that they're maybe not totally considering them as the head coach, but maybe Schneider is vetting them and in a sense maybe recruiting them for possible coordinator roles.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought, and something you mentioned earlier about the second that your offensive coordinator or that your offense has success, your coordinator is vulnerable to exactly what's going on right now. Brady, I'm going to ask you a trivia question. Of all the offensive coordinators in 2021, how many are with the same team now?
From 2021, how many are with the same team now?
As offensive coordinator.
I'm guessing that you're going to tell me there's not that many. It's probably a very small number. So of the 32, I will say it's probably, you can count them on one hand. I'll say 4.
Zero. None of them. So that's what I'm saying, right? Like, this is why I lean offense also. It's what we want. And, here's the thing. I think that the Super Bowl or nothing mindset that I think takes up way too much real estate within football discourse. has really damaged the conversation about what makes a good team, because Tom Brady and Bill Belichick obliterated the expectations of what good means. They just kept winning Super Bowls. Winning Super Bowls requires a very good team, to be sure, but every champion has had good fortune and or injury luck along the way. Like, to me, a healthier way of evaluating success is looking at teams that made the divisional round. Are you one of the final 8? Because if you're one of the final 8, you have a legitimate shot of taking a run at this thing. You're in the top 25%. And it also gives you a little bit of a sample size of good to great teams. You can say, okay, what are common denominators here? And the thing that stood out to me about the 8 teams that played last weekend, they all have forward-thinking offenses. Yes, some of them have great defenses, no question about it. But they all have faster-paced offenses that most of them are a bit more run-heavy. They're more aggressive on fourth down. They play at a quicker pace. They use more motion, all of that stuff. Like, that is a consistency throughout all of the teams that made it that far. And, you know, to your earlier point, like, that's the direction the league is going. Now, I know it's a lot of reading of tea leaves right now. There's not any, to my knowledge, concrete evidence to go off of. But do you get a sense that John Schneider is leaning one way or the other?
No, I really don't. And I'm not going to pretend that I do. What's interesting to me about this search is what Schneider told us at his press conference about a week ago, where he said the one directive from Jody Allen is that they maintain their positive culture. And what strikes me about that is that I think that may narrow their options, frankly, because when I hear that, I wonder, okay, let's say it's a guy like Mike Vrabel. I don't doubt for a second that John Schneider and Mike Vrabel would be really aligned, and that those two guys would get along. They both just seem like, you know, man's men, guys. Like, I think those two guys would vibe together, which is a big part of, I think, you know, what Schneider is going to be looking for is knowing a guy that it's got to be a guy that he knows that he can work with. But I wonder is somebody like Mike Vrabel, who has been a head coach, who's been the coach of the year, who's pretty well established in the NFL, is he going to want to come in and adopt someone else's culture and really adapt to what they've done?
This is my thing, right? And, like, if you go the culture route, it's going to be different culture. Every single player in that locker room knows what the Pete Carroll situation, knows that routine. That's a very unique one. And, you know, Vrabel's culture is different. Maybe there's some continuity with a Dan Quinn. I think this is what makes Dave Canales an interesting potential option as well. There is some continuity there because the way Pete Carroll is Monday through Saturday, I think, is excellent. Like, there's no part of me that wants to replace Monday through Saturday. It's what happens on Sunday that opens it up to discussion. And my whole thing is, look, if you're going to fire Pete Carroll, if you're going to fire the most successful coach in franchise history, take a big fucking swing at the next thing. Like, I don't want just more culture, but it's different. Like, the issue, from my perspective, is not that Seattle has lost because there's something deficient in the culture. It's on the field. It's the X's and O's. And, like, going back to the offensive thing, just look, man, if it's all the same, give me an offense that doesn't run at a bottom 10 pace in the NFL every year. Like, what happens if you bring someone in and they say, we're going to see what happens if DK Metcalf gets 170 targets this year? You know, like, I would like to see a team just lean into that and scare the shit out of some opponents.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that this offense underachieved last year, and a new coordinator is going to have quite a bit to work with, even with the questions about, you know, Geno and the long-term viability of that. But I think it's an attractive job, and I think there would be a lot for an offensive-minded head coach to come in and work with. And yeah, back to the point about Dan Quinn, like he's like Vrabel would be, you know, he's a guy who's done it before, but I don't think this culture would be a big departure for Dan Quinn because he's been in this culture before, and he, you know, probably had a hand in helping build it during his stint here earlier. And so I just think it's culture-wise, would be easier for a young first-time guy to do that. And so, I don't know, Ben Johnson has always, from the moment I heard Schneider say that, Ben Johnson was kind of the guy I had a gut feeling about. Now, I don't know if I've seen a report about the Seahawks seeking a second interview with him. Maybe that has something to do with the timing and the fact that Lions are playing in the NFC Championship game. But I don't know. Typically, those things, I don't know. I feel like we would have heard it by now. So I don't know what to make of that. But
and I feel like with a guy like Ben Johnson, you have to do as much selling Seattle on him as he does having to sell himself to Seattle, because he is at the top of a lot of lists. And I do think Seattle's attractive. I think it's the second most attractive job opening in the NFL because they've got players, and most teams that are looking for a new head coach stunk last year, and the Seahawks didn't stink.
Yeah. Do you think the Chargers are the best job?
I think the Commanders are, and it's funny, Cigar Thoughts timing comes through once again. It was just announced that Jim Harbaugh has taken the Chargers job. So if that was considered, maybe a more attractive landing spot because of Justin Herbert, because of the location, it's off the table now.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was some smoke, some kind of out of nowhere smoke recently about Pete Carroll supposedly making a push for the Chargers job. And I wondered if that was the Chargers leaking that out there to try to, give Harbaugh a kick in the butt and say, hey, if you don't hurry up and take this offer that we've had on the table, then your old nemesis might come in here and make things interesting.
That was my exact same thought when I saw that report.
Was it really?
I was like, that is pure like Dean Spanos leverage right there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think Carroll would want to coach. I think he's going to end up being a coach again at some point. And I thought that the Chargers, if there was any opening this offseason that would make sense for him, it'd be the Chargers, just because of the LA connection and the fact that the roster is pretty strong. But I don't know how willing he would be to sign up to coach for the Spanos family. But anyways, that's funny that we both had the same thought on that kind of rumor there.
Totally. And like to your point about, I hate the term retread. It sounds like it makes any previous NFL head coach sound like a total bum when you call him a retread.
Yeah.
But whatever, that's the term that gets used. So when I'm thinking about, an unproven coordinator versus a retread, my buddy Tyson and I were watching the playoff games of Buffalo Wild Wings this past weekend. We were talking about this and we went through team by team and looked at their head coaches. Okay, how did they get hired? Were they a coordinator or did they have previous head coaching experience? And honestly, man, the track record of NFL coaches that had been fired from a previous head coaching job is not great. Like, yes, you have Andy Reid, and depending on your feelings on like Mike McCarthy or Doug Peterson, modicum of success there. But for the most part, it doesn't go super well. But by the same token, that was Pete Carroll too, obviously with a decade interlude there in college. But for me, it's just like, the conventional wisdom is, well, if you get a guy who's done it before, you're providing some sort of floor, right? Like it's not going to bottom out. But that's really not the case when you really go team by team. And I think that if you're not protecting a floor by going with a known commodity, shoot for the ceiling and let's try and find the next D'Amico Ryans. Let's try and find the next Mike McDaniel, whoever. The next Sean McVay, of course, is what everyone wants. Shanahan was a coordinator ahead of time. Harbaugh was a special teams coach. So, this stuff, it just feels like when I look at the very best teams in the NFL, the ones that I want Seattle to emulate and eventually beat, they're guys that hired hotshot coordinators.
Yeah, I think the one thing that's encouraging for the Seahawks about this situation that they're in is that this is a football guy in John Schneider who's making this decision. This is not an owner who is, and I'm not speaking specifically about their owner, but just the fact that, you have owners in a lot of places who are in charge of hiring the head coach who, I don't really like this term, and Pete Carroll used it as he was railing against the fact that he was fired, but he said that decision was made by people who aren't football people.
Yes.
But I think when you're hiring a coach, it helps to have, you would much rather have John Schneider making that decision than, somebody who's just not that heavily involved in football. And
that's right.
And look, Schneider, he's been around the NFL a long time. He's got a ton of connections. I don't know if he's going to get more than one shot to get this right. So there is a lot of pressure on him, but I would feel better about having somebody like him make this decision than an owner who is, maybe more prone to, being sold by kind of flash, or being sold by, who's going to put butts in the seats, who's going to get people talking about the team. That doesn't always mean
totally for every McVay you have Brandon Staley, for every Shanahan you have a Cliff Kingsbury, right? Like these guys who haven't been NFL head coaches before, and they're not it. But yeah, I'd be really curious. One last question, because I do want to talk about the teams that are left in the playoffs with you too, because if there's one thing I know about you, you cover the Seahawks, but you are a football guy. And as I often say on this show, I'm a football fan first and the Seahawks fan second. But one thing that I do want to ask you is, how fragile do you think John Schneider's position is right now? Like, if it's another underwhelming season, call it any missed playoffs, is he on the hot seat?
Again, it's so hard to know what, like, anytime we're talking about a decision like this at the ownership level, it's really hard to say with any level of authority, just because it's not like, Jerry Jones, who sort of wears his thoughts on his sleeves. And we don't
have Jim Irsay owning this team.
I mean, everybody knows that Mike McCarthy is on the hottest of hot seats. Kevin Clark had a great line the other day on Twitter where he said, nobody has ever been more pre-fired than Mike McCarthy next season. Totally. It's obvious with some teams. It's just such a mystery with this team. I think, just venturing a guess, I mean, look, Schneider has always had like the sort of excuse, and I think there's some truth to it, that, look, he's put together a really good team, a good enough roster. In the last, I would say this past year, like, this roster was better than a 9-win team, and that, the blame should fall on the coaching staff for not getting enough out of that roster. Well, when you then hire the coach, if that happens again, then ultimately that comes back on you, because you're the guy who hired that coach. And so, I think there's a lot of pressure on him. Is it a make or break season? I wouldn't guess so. I mean, maybe if they bottom out, anything can happen, but, I wouldn't imagine that he is on a hot. If Jody Allen trusted him enough to make this decision and to be the head of the franchise and to have personnel say, which actually I believe was built into the contract he signed a couple years ago, but she could have fired him while firing Pete Carroll as well. So the fact that she is trusting him to run the organization, that to me tells me that he's got a little longer leash than just one bad season.
Yeah. Well, listen, another thing I know about you is you're not just going to speculate recklessly, and I do appreciate that. But same token, stepping away from Seattle, there's 4 teams left in the NFL, and I'm like thrilled with the 4 teams that are left. And I still would have been whoever won that Chiefs-Bills game, which another classic, right? But on the AFC side, you're getting pure quarterback porn, like Mahomes versus Lamar. Lamar's probably MVP this year. Mahomes is considered the best quarterback in the NFL. I think that is super, super fascinating. And on the other side, you've got like these 2 coaches that have completely transformed the teams that they coach, right? It's not about one specific. When you think about the Lions, I think a lot of people think about Dan Campbell before they think about any specific player. And with the 49ers, I mean, they've got so many all-pros, but like, this is the fact that the Brock Purdy discussion is a thing is because Shanahan has built a Death Star over there. So you're looking at these teams, the 49ers, the Lions, the Ravens, the Chiefs, again, they're just inevitable. What has surprised you most about the playoffs so far?
What has surprised me? I mean, the Cowboys getting bounced in the first round was surprising, and maybe it shouldn't totally be just because of their history of just pretty epic playoff flubs, but that was one of them. I mean, Jordan Love, as a first-time starter, taking his team to the brink of the NFC Championship game was another one. And again, that throw he made at the end of that game was all sorts of horrific. But the guy, I mean, the second half of the season that he had, total baller. So
he's a dog.
Those would be the 2 things. He is, and I don't know. There's something kind of admirable about him where he just doesn't seem like a flashy look at me guy. He just sort of seems like a Green Bay, small town kind of quarterback. And,
totally. Well, let's
yeah.
talk about this for a second. I'm so glad you brought up Jordan Love and Green Bay, because I do think there's some relevance to Seattle here, in that, you know, everyone looks at Green Bay like, oh my God, they did it again. Another great quarterback. All these other teams are just like, what the fuck? We're constantly looking for that next guy.
Yeah.
But it's not like it's just by chance. You know, with the new collective bargaining agreement, the greatest value in all of American sport is a good quarterback on a rookie contract. So if you draft a rookie quarterback, it's like, hey, get him in there. Don't waste these cheap years. Get him in there. The Packers have been like, fuck that.
Yeah.
We're going to get like 3 years ahead of this and draft our next guy and let him sit. And it's like, okay. So if you're kind of on the fence with Geno, and he's a lot easier to move on from contractually after this year than he is before this year, is this the time where you draft a guy in the middle of the first round and let him sit for a year or two and learn and just swallow that perceived value in the hopes that they develop in a way that a lot of times guys who are just thrust right in don't?
I think it's a lot easier for somebody like me to say, yeah, they should do it. And I can confidently say that they should have taken more quarterbacks than the 2 that they've drafted in the 14 years that Carroll and Schneider have been here. I, for the life of me, can't figure out why that number is what it is, considering where Schneider came from. You know, a Green Bay organization that under Ron Wolf was
exactly
taking quarterbacks, almost every year. Now, look, I think it can be easier said than done. Like, that was not an easy decision for them to do that, for Green Bay to do that with, you know, Jordan Love, with Aaron Rodgers still there. I mean, there's some awkwardness that you've got to get over. You've got a quarterback, the veteran guy who's going to be ticked off at that. And then you're also, you know, sacrificing an early draft pick on a position that you know is not going to play for at least a year if he ever really pans out at all. So those are the decisions that teams like the Seahawks weigh when they're faced with that decision. I mean, look, if that guy is guaranteed to be Aaron Rodgers or guaranteed to even look like what Jordan Love has looked like this past season, then they would do that. But it's
so hard because you have other needs, right? Like
right.
that's the thing is like, okay, let's say they use the 16th pick on a Michael Penix or a Bo Nix or a JJ McCarthy. It's like, well, shit, man, we need linemen.
Right.
We need a linebacker.
Yeah.
We might need a safety.
Yeah. And look, you can get over the awkwardness. I think Geno, as confident as he is, and knowing that, I think, you know, he's realistically knows that, like, yeah, he was up and down this season, and this is what happens in the NFL. Like, when you play like that and you don't have the type of season you had the year before, then, you know, there's going to be some question about your job security, and the team's going to want to look at other options. That you can get over that awkwardness. It's harder though to just bypass, you know, a guy who you would know is going to come in and help you at a position.
That's right.
Of need. And so I know, like, Mel Kiper Jr. in his first mock draft, I think he had JJ McCarthy going to the Seahawks at 16. I mean, I could see that. I don't
love it.
I could see that a lot more if Pete Carroll were still the head coach, because JJ McCarthy looks a lot more like a Pete Carroll quarterback than he does a John Schneider quarterback, meaning a guy who, you know, played really well the role of point guard at Michigan. 44 touchdown passes, 9 interceptions over the past 2 years. That was a Michigan offense that totally leaned on the run game. And that's not to say that he can't carry an offense in the NFL, but based on what he's asked to do, he looks more like a Pete Carroll quarterback as opposed to the quarterbacks that we know that John Schneider has had an affinity for. I mean, John Schneider tried to trade Russell Wilson to the Browns in 2018 because he wanted to draft Josh Allen, number 1 overall.
Yes.
Drew Lock for all of, you know, his, you know, kind of shaky resume. Like, Drew Lock is a very toolsy, kind of prototypical, big-armed quarterback, and so you know, and another gunslinger like Josh Allen. So those are kind of the quarterbacks
that Schneider likes. That guy, he likes that prototype. That to me is what's so fascinating about all of this now that Pete Carroll is out of the picture, because it's like, I think Geno is good enough. Question becomes, is good enough good enough?
Yeah. And look, I mean, I think the reason Schneider gravitates towards those quarterbacks is, look at the quarterback who was in Green Bay when he was coming up there. It was the ultimate gunslinger in Brett Favre, and the guy with the cannon for an arm. So,
dude,
and
the
look,
NFL's John Wayne.
Yeah, right. And he also drafted Russell Wilson, who was not that prototypical guy, and who played with a very strong governor on him, and wasn't the gunslinger. So that's not to say that he's got one type and one type only, but going back to a guy like McCarthy, he and maybe he shows that he's got a lot of those tools, but just based on resume, I would see that more if Carroll were the coach than if Schneider were making the decision.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. Look, Mike's going to get pissed at me because he wants me to move along, but I got one more question for you before we do. Okay, how confident are you that the Seahawks would have taken a quarterback at 5 this past year if one of Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, or Anthony Richardson had made it there?
Well, in that scenario, I know this. I know that Will Anderson Jr. was the guy that they really wanted, and that Witherspoon
I heard
was
the same.
A close second. If one of those guys were there, I think, I don't know. I mean, because this is one of those things that's hard because you talk to people and it's like, oh yeah, we love that guy. We love CJ Stroud. Oh, I'm sure it's easy to say that now. And I didn't get a great feel for what they were going to do before, just because things tend to get tight. And people play things close to the vest. So I know after the fact, I don't think that they would have taken Richardson had he been there. If it was between
interesting.
Witherspoon and Richardson, I think they would have stuck with Witherspoon. I think that that wasn't so much a reflection on Richardson. I think they thought he had the talent to justify that kind of pick, but I think that they viewed it as kind of a value question, and maybe this goes back to the idea of, do you draft a quarterback when you got your starter in place? Do you draft a quarterback knowing that he's going to have to sit for a year? I think they just didn't feel like value-wise it made sense to spend that kind of money, the money that would come with the 5th overall pick,
right?
Yeah, on a guy who was going to be a backup for at least a year and was going to have to develop, because they had already re-signed Geno. Geno was going to be here for at least a year, and I think that was. I just don't think they thought it made sense value-wise. The question of whether or not he had the talent to justify that pick, that was totally separate, and I think that they thought he was worthy of that kind of pick, but it was a value decision. So would they have drafted Stroud or Bryce Young if one of those guys were there? I kind of think so. I just don't know. It's really hard to say.
Yeah, of course. Hypotheticals are fun. But something that's not hypothetical are the 4 teams that are remaining. So last thing before I let you get out of here. 49ers, Lions, Ravens, Chiefs. Who wins this weekend? And if there was a $10,000 reward for getting the Super Bowl winner and loser correct exactly, what would be your guess?
Yeah, I think it's going to be Ravens, 49ers.
It's the Super Bowl the NFL deserves this year.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, we've seen that matchup, so I think we know. I don't know how you could pick 49ers, although I mean they are a loaded team. But we saw how that went on Christmas night, and it was not pretty. So were you asking the $10,000 question?
$10,000 question: who wins the Super Bowl? Who loses the Super Bowl? You got to get both teams right.
Yeah, I think it's going to be Baltimore over San Francisco. I think that Detroit is going to be able to keep it close, just because Dan Campbell is going to will them to keep it close. And San Francisco may not have Debo, who's a huge part of their offense, but I think San Francisco is going to win. Baltimore is going to beat Kansas City, and then Baltimore is going to win the Super Bowl over the 49ers.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was like, all right, if it is Baltimore or San Francisco, we've already seen this. Let's, that's an easy Baltimore take. Then I remember the $3,000 I lost betting the Chiefs over the Bucks, because the Chiefs had beat the Bucks by 30 points in the regular season. So it's funny what 2 weeks of prep can do, especially when teams already whipped your ass and you can just grind down on that film, because a guy like Shanahan's going to say like, oh yeah, could have done that different, could have done that different, could have done that different. 3 big plays go differently, that's a totally different game entirely.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, didn't Trent Williams get hurt late in that game?
Yes, I think he's going to be okay. But I mean, he's okay now. But yeah, he was hurt in that game. I think they were losing it anyway.
Yeah, it probably would have gone that way anyways. Yeah, and it's a good point. You give a brilliant offensive mind like Kyle Shanahan 2 weeks, and anything is possible, even overcoming. And look, it's not like you look at those rosters and say that Baltimore has a clear talent advantage. I mean, they've obviously got a talent advantage at quarterback and the MVP and Brock Purdy, but I mean, San Francisco still may have top to bottom just as talented, if not more talented roster. So, I don't think you can totally discount the possibility of them winning that game. It's just, for me, it's hard to pick it any other way, knowing what happened on Christmas Eve.
Dude,
but that's why they play the games. It's not like they're going to cancel the Super Bowl just because of what happened on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day.
Right, exactly. And the thing is like, I mean, Baltimore looks completely unbeatable right now. They still got to get past Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid because here they are for the 6th straight season in the AFC. I mean, we are looking at another Brady Belichick situation, and like, you want to be the man, you got to beat the man. But I'll tell you this much: if they do, Lamar is minted. They win the Super Bowl this year, Lamar's a Hall of Famer.
2 MVPs and 1 Super Bowl in his first 6 seasons. Yeah.
That's a short list, and they're all in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. And you just know there's going to be more too. I mean,
dude, oh my God, he's still so young. He's like 26 years old. It's
amazing. He must have been 21 years old when he came into the NFL. He's still nowhere near 30 years old.
I mean, Lamar's my guy. He's like my favorite player in the league. So I would love to see him raising the Lombardi, and I would also love to see the 49ers feel like they have to go back to the drawing board. But, that's just me being a Seahawks fan a little bit. Listen, Brady, this has been awesome, man. We are so grateful for your time and your insight. The thing we know is that when we have you on, you're going to bring it. You did it again today. We'd love to have you back on as we move towards what's going to be a very interesting 2024 season. Yeah, let's do it. I really enjoyed talking with you guys. It's been a lot of fun. Let's not wait another year plus to do it again. We should do it again, maybe after the head coaching search or after free agency at some point. You have my word. We also got to get on the golf course together, Jackson. Guaranteed. Hey, next 18's on me for sure. I promise you that. Listen, last thing, where can the folks listening find more of you and your stuff? Just go to old Twitter, twitterx.com, at Brady Henderson. So no underscores, no nothing, just at Brady Henderson. And I know most of the people listening are already following you, but if you're hearing this and you're not, and you're interested in what the Seahawks are doing, absolutely make sure you're following Brady because he's as dialed in as they get. Appreciate that. Yeah, thanks again for having me, guys. All right, y'all. That's going to do it for today. As always, you can find Mike and I on social media as well. I am on Twitter at Jacson Bevins. That's Jacson. Remember that no K is okay when spelling my name. Mike is on Twitter at Mike Barwin, and the show itself is at Cigar Thoughts. You can catch full video episodes on our YouTube channel at Cigar Thoughts and find the rest of our socials at cigarthoughtsnfl.com. This episode is brought to you by Westland Distillery in Seattle, which is my favorite local whiskey maker. If you're watching on YouTube, you've seen me enjoying a glass of their new Cloudburst Cask Exchange, which is smooth as hell and has a unique finish. Westland is an American single malt whiskey distillery in the Soto neighborhood of Seattle. Their tasting room and bar are open to the public, where they serve whiskey flights, cocktails, and small plates. There's a bottle shop on site featuring distillery exclusive releases and more, located at 2931 First Avenue, a little over a mile south of Lumen Field. Their Jerryana No. 8 was just named the No. 3 whiskey in the entire world by Whiskey Advocate, so needless to say, I'm stoked to be working with them. And one of the reasons I love their whiskeys so much is their excellent pairings with a good cigar. And speaking of, we do have our own special release of cigars that you can purchase at a terrific price as a listener of the show. Until now, you've been able to order your own bundle of 10 for just $169, which is less than half of what this blend sells for in cigars on the open market. But because of the success of the Cigar Thoughts release, we are able to lower the price to just $149, and we've decided to keep it there for a while. That's right, only $149 for a bundle of 10. As many of you know, We partnered with one of the most prestigious cigar manufacturers in the world to release these official Cigar Thoughts cigars, which you can order directly from cigarthoughtsnfl.com. Just follow the link on the show page to get these easy-to-smoke stogies rolled with 13-year aged premium Dominican tobacco leaf, or hit us up on Twitter or Instagram and we'll send you the details directly. The cigars, they come with a Bovita humidification pack and a Mylar storage bag to make sure they stay fresh, whether you have a humidor or not. Of course, you can listen to this show and read every article at fieldgoals.com. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you like the show, drop us a 5-star rating and leave a quick review. Thank you to all of y'all listening for your continued support of the show. We know that you've only got so much time for podcasts in your life, and it's an honor to be a part of that for y'all. Please know that by sharing this show on social media and with your friends, you give us the juice to keep making this happen. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, onwards and upwards, my friends.